Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving into a really wild experiment, right at the intersection of law, technology, and human rights. So what happens when you take a single, incredibly dense legal case, specifically the conviction of a scientist named Dr. Chen Jingyuan, and feed the exact same legal documents from start to finish into multiple top-tier AI models? Well, the results give us this absolutely unprecedented glimpse into the future of justice, and I seriously can't wait to break it all down for you. To really hook you on why this matters, let's talk about the number 6. In this experiment, 6 rival AI models, we're talking Copilot, DeepSeek, Gemini, ChatGPT, Grok, and Qwen, were tasked with independently analyzing the exact same case files, defense statements, and court verdicts. And here's the crazy part. Despite having entirely different training backgrounds and processing architectures, all 6 of them reached an identical, unified legal consensus. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for decoding this digital consensus. We'll start with 1. 6 AIs, 1 consensus. 2. Defining the pocket crime. 3. The missing legal pillars. 4. A broken judicial process. 5. The psychological collision. And finally, 6. The systemic flaw. Moving right into Chapter 1, 6 AIs, 1 consensus. And this brilliantly illustrates how each model brought its own completely unique analytical lens to the exact same set of facts. Gemini, for instance, zeroed in on deep legal logic, basically dismantling the court's arguments around intent. Then you have ChatGPT, which took a structural approach, mapping out procedural violations. Grok zoomed way out to look at global human rights standards, while DeepSeek and Qwen focused on technical policy and practical legal checklists. And finally, Copilot brought this totally fascinating psychological perspective. Put them all together, and they formed a comprehensive 360-degree assessment matrix of the whole shebang.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Defining the Pocket Crime.
According to the source documents, the specific charge against Dr. Chen was picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Now, the AI models uniformly define this legal concept as a pocket crime. If you're not familiar with the term, in legal circles, that means it's a catch-all charge. The AIs noted that this statute is increasingly being used in the context of network speech to penalize behavior that doesn't actually fit into strict, clearly defined legal parameters. So it's essentially a blank check for prosecution.
And that sets up our core conflict perfectly. On one side, you have this vast, vague, catch-all criminal charge, and on the other, you have Dr. Chen, a complex systems scientist who is literally just using a VPN to retweet art, historical data, political opinions, and official embassy posts to a remarkably tiny audience. I mean, this sheer mismatch of scale is exactly what set the stage for the AI's collective teardown of the charges.
Let's get into Chapter 3, The Missing Legal Pillars.
It turns out every single AI model flagged 4 very specific missing elements in the conviction. First up, they noted there was absolutely no fabrication. I mean, Dr. Chen was sharing art and opinions, which, by definition, inherently cannot be categorized as false facts. Second, there was 0 subjective intent, meaning no proof of malice whatsoever. Third, no severe consequence. There was no actual chaos in public order. And finally, his motive was pure academic curiosity, not provocation. The AIs essentially found that these absolute foundational pillars were completely missing from the court's evidence. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the incredibly stark contrast in legal reasoning. To prove intent without direct evidence, the court argued that because Dr. Chen has a PhD, he has a high level of education, and therefore he quote-unquote should have known the content was harmful. Well, the AI models completely rejected this. They identified the court's reasoning as objective imputation. In plain English, that's essentially a presumption of guilt based purely on a person's identity and education level rather than, any actual direct behavioral evidence of criminal intent. And to further dismantle the case, the AIs pointed to this highly surprising fact: 100. Dr. Chen had fewer than 100 followers, and his total lifetime retweets numbered under 100. That's it. Because of this incredibly low reach, the AIs concluded that the legal requirement of causing a severe consequence to public order was entirely fictional. There was no systemic disruption, no rioting, nothing. Just a microscopic digital footprint. Which leads us to Chapter 4, A Broken Judicial Process.
Let's move to and see how this builds across the timeline of the case, because the procedural violations flagged by ChatGPT and Qwen are pretty staggering. In the arrest phase, there was no warrant, and passwords were extracted under alleged duress. Then, during the first trial, the court held a secret hearing where Dr. Chen's substantive offense was actively restricted. And by the time we get to the second trial, there was no public hearing at all, and the burden of proof was entirely inverted.
And that inversion of proof is perfectly captured in this exact quote from the Kunming Intermediate Court. The court stated, "The appellant Chen Jingyuan failed to submit new evidence to prove his appeal reasons." Now, the AI models neutrally reported this as a critical, structural violation of the presumption of innocence. Think about it. In any standard criminal case, the state has to prove guilt. The defendant is never, ever legally required to submit evidence to prove themselves innocent.
Now for Chapter 5, the psychological collision.
According to the source material, Copilot viewed the case not just as a standard legal dispute, but as a profound collision of psychological frameworks. On the one hand, you've got Dr. Chen, driven by an individual psychology of meaning, character strengths, and extreme resilience. But on the other hand, you have the judicial system, operating on a psychology of negativity bias, a heavy focus on deficits, and risk amplification. It is literally a clash between a meaning-driven individual and a risk-driven institution.
Copilot actually analyzed Dr. Chen's 20,000-word defense statement, which, by the way, he wrote from prison, and identified these specific character strengths: curiosity, critical thinking, courage, honesty, and perseverance. But here's the tragedy, as the AI points out. The system entirely misread these positive human traits. His curiosity was read as provocation, his critical thinking seen as defiance. The system viewed his psychological strengths purely as a threat to rigid stability.
And finally, Chapter 6, the systemic flaw.
So, the crucial point is how all of this connects to the PERMA model. If you haven't heard of it, it's a famous positive psychology framework based on positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. DeepSeek found that throughout this entire ordeal, the judicial system systematically blocked every single element of human flourishing for Dr. Chen. His positive emotions were replaced with fear. His engagement in his science was halted. His relationships were isolated. His self-constructed meaning was overridden by a criminal label, and his academic accomplishments were essentially stripped away.
And that leads directly to DeepSeek's ultimate conclusion. This case represents a fundamental failure of systemic resilience. When faced with a unique individual exercising intellectual curiosity, the system demonstrated what the AI called anti-resilience. Actually, scratch that. It's worse than just failing to adapt. Instead of learning and allowing a safe space for ideological exploration, the system just defaulted to rigid stability and repression. It basically failed a vital stress test on how to handle the natural human pursuit of knowledge.
Which leaves us with this incredibly provocative thought from DeepSeek. Can a rigid system ever achieve flourishing compatibility, a state where it actually nurtures rather than punishes human character strengths? Or will it always view curiosity and independent thought as a fundamental threat? As AI continues to hold a mirror up to our own human systems, it's a question we all need to seriously start asking. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.